Off and running, Julie.
Great, thank you, Kevin.
Mhm.
Well, good afternoon it is here in Northern Ireland, so good afternoon, or those of you that are maybe on the other side of the Atlantic, it is good morning to you. As Kevin said, my name is Julie Allen and calling from Northern Ireland. Today I'd like to talk to you about improving resilience and fulfilment in the workplace using the ProSocial Matrix. And if we start with the first question, really, which is, well, why are we talking about this today? I think probably all of you that have signed in for this webinar will only too well realise the many challenges that we have in the workplace of improving resilience and fulfilment. What I should say at this point is, if anybody has any questions as I'm going through the presentation, please feel free to include those in the chat box and I will answer those at the end of the presentation. So those challenges that we have in life from an individual perspective are many. So we all face those challenges of going to work every day, performing at levels required, achieving those targets, focusing on our careers, considering the politics perhaps that's going on in the workplace. We're trying to manage the work-life balance. And at the same time, we have constant emails and phone calls to deal with, both in working hours and outside of hours. We're also accessible today on a 24/7 basis with those wonderful inventions of smartphones. And we are accessible through social media, the messaging apps, phone calls and emails. So we're constantly at people's beck and call. One of the things that we know as well is, or you'll appreciate, that we're living in this volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. Whatever side of the Atlantic you're on, we know too well of the volatility in politics at the moment and the impact that that has on us as individuals, the worry that that places in our mind of what's going on in the future. With our family commitments and all of those relationships that we have that we're also trying to balance and deal with. That has a major impact then in terms of the workplace. So you might have considered, well, why start with the individual? Well, the individual with all of those challenges of life comes to work every day. And those challenges have left many millions of days being lost due to ill health because those challenges at times become too much. Stress, depression and anxiety are one of the top causes of long-term absence in the workplace. The World Health Organization calls stress the epidemic of the 21st century. And presenteeism, or people coming to work when they're ill, is increasing. There's diminishing levels of trust in organizations. And Gallup tell us that 87% of employees worldwide are not engaged at work. So what can we do and how can we improve resilience and fulfillment in the workplace and people living the lives that they want to live? Well, what we do is we start with the ACT matrix, designed by Kevin, who's on the call with us. And when we're using the ACT matrix, what we do is, first of all, we look at understanding with individuals the difference between the behaviours and what goes on in our mind. So first of all, I'm going to apologise for the numbers on the screen. Those were my transitions that I'd originally planned to use in presentation mode, which you can see I'm not using. But if we look at the difference between what goes on in our mind and the difference between the behaviours or the five senses experience, can I get you to imagine that you're eating a chocolate bar? or perhaps even chocolate cake. Just imagine that for the moment. Perhaps you'd even help and engage with me by using the chat box, and let me know when you're imagining that bar of chocolate or that chocolate cake. What are you tasting or what are you smelling? Can you smell the chocolate? Can you taste it? And if so, how is that the case? Because you're experiencing that in your mind. And just that simple exercise helps us to know that there is a difference between what goes on in our mind and the five senses experience. Because our mind is very able to experience what we can experience in real life in our mind. And our mind gets confused between the thought and the reality. The second thing that we want to do with individuals in the ACT matrix is to help them to understand the difference between what it feels like to move away and towards what is important. And those, in terms of what is important, are the life direction that we want to move in. So using the ACT matrix, we ask the first question in the bottom right of the matrix, asking who and what is important to us. So let's start with the who. Who is important to you? Again, perhaps you'd like to share in the chat box with who is important to you. Anybody willing to get involved and let me know who might be important to them? Great, thank you. My wife, friends, family, work colleagues, community. You can see I've given some examples. Yeah, my wife, my son, my cat. Those are all important things to us in life. Kevin's dogs. If we ask the second question, which is then what is important to you in relation to those different people? Again, I've given some examples here, but you might include some of yours again in the chat box. They could be things like compassion, kindness towards those individuals, trust in the relationships. Michael says health, flexibility. It could be accepting. It could be respectful relationships. Fun. Gail, yeah, says fun. Absolutely. One of those things in relation to certainly family and friends and work colleagues is having some fun with them. So having understood who and what is important to you, then we move into the bottom left of the matrix by asking the question, then what shows up inside that moves us away from who and what is important to us. Again, remember that what goes on in the bottom part of the matrix is what is happening in our mind. So if we think of what stuff shows up inside that gets us moving away from the who and what is important, anybody want to give me any examples of what you might do? I've got some examples here of, from an emotional perspective, what shows up might be some anger, it might be anxiety, it could be frustration, agitation, or perhaps feeling swamped with life. Some thoughts that might pop up. Do I really fit in? Am I good enough for this job? I haven't time to exercise. Or I can't go to an event with the children. I'm just too busy. Others are suggesting things like jealousy, insecurity, feeling overwhelmed. And then having answered that question, we're moving into the top part of the matrix to look at behaviours. Moving to the top part of the matrix, we ask, well, what do you do that moves you away from that unwanted stuff? These we know we all too easily do when those thoughts and feelings pop up. So I'm too busy to cook, so I'll get a takeaway. Procrastination, I'll leave that until tomorrow. We go to work sometimes feeling unwell when we know we shouldn't. We spend much time on Netflix or social media or YouTube, fast food. Or sometimes when we're feeling really down and feeling stressed, we could resort to alcohol or drugs. And when we're feeling overwhelmed with life, sometimes it's much easier to avoid family and friends. Conducting these types of behaviours, we can see now, using the matrix, that we're noticing that we're moving away from who and what is important to us and not moving towards those. So asking the fourth question in the matrix then is, well, what could I do to move towards who and what is important to me? Well, if we want to live that rich, meaningful, fulfilled life, and we want to continue to move towards what is important to us, and we're considering resilience and fulfillment, we might think about some regular exercise, taking some time out to rest so that we can be productive, eating well, starting some new interests or hobbies, scheduling time for family and friends, and also getting enough sleep. Anybody like to maybe suggest anything else in terms of towards moves that would be useful, that would move you towards what was important? Yoga, absolutely. Yoga, when that is being used to move you towards who and what is important to you. Meditate, Jill, thank you, would be another one in terms of taking time out to rest. And meditation helps us again to be much more in the moment. And using this matrix is helping us to be in the moment by helping us to notice the difference between what goes on in our mind and those behaviours, and also noticing the difference between what it feels like to move away and towards what is important. So we can teach people to use the ACT matrix on a daily basis, even to help them identify what away moves they might make or have made in the day past, and also then to plan moves for the day in moving towards. Michael's even suggesting a phone call to family and friends that they haven't been in touch with for a while, and also feeding a cat. Thanks, Michael. So having gone through the ACT matrix with individuals and looking at the I and helping people to notice the difference, in a workplace setting, we can move to the we, and that's the group. And we can use the ProSocial Matrix to help us now look at what we can do to improve resilience and fulfillment. Starting at the bottom of the matrix again, using the same matrix, we're asking slightly different questions. In the first instance, we're asking, what is the group's shared purpose? Asking the group that you're working with what your shared purpose is, our shared purpose, the we. Some people might say, well, it's about providing the best possible service or products to customers. Anybody help me with what might be your shared purpose with your team? It might be that collaboration in terms of that shared purpose is vital to be able to provide those products and services. It might be that there is a requirement for the team to be flexible in terms of their approach and the tasks that they have to do. Safety perhaps could be one of those things that's paramount. It could be integrity in terms of how we deal with each other, and it could be passionate in terms of the services that we're providing. Now, at this point, having talked about safety, perhaps one of the things to mention is when we're using the ProSocial Matrix, what we're wanting to do is to create psychological safety with the group. Because some of the following questions that we might ask, people need to be able to feel safe in terms of responding to those. So we might, to begin with, ask those slightly differently so as to create that psychological safety. So focusing on what's going on in the mind with the group, we might then ask the question, so what shows up inside team members and gets in the way of achieving the shared purpose? Some of those things that might show up in terms of the emotional perspective could be things like envy, anger, anxiety, undermined or stressed. So instead of saying what does show up, we might ask the question, what could show up in team members that moves us away? Thanks, Kevin. Kevin saying, yeah, fear is one of those feelings that pops up. Financial insecurity. Is my job a threat? Ego is another one that pops up in this quadrant. Some thoughts that might go on in our minds are things like, well, I really haven't got time for this. No one really cares about what I'm working on or about me. Well, I do it better than my colleagues, or I'm too busy to help. Or they might also think that they're not up to the job. So what goes on in that bottom left in the mind is helping to draw out from team members what pops up that prevents team members from moving towards that shared purpose. Much of what goes on here can consume our minds, take up a lot of time playing some of these dramas out. So much so that we actually believe that those things are true. So what we want to do then is to move team members into those behaviours in the top of the matrix and ask them then the question, what do team members do to move away from what shows up inside? Does anybody have any particular examples you'd like to share of what might show up inside team members that helps them to move away from what shows up inside? You can see some of the examples I've given here are we arrive early and stay at work late despite how much we have to do. Yeah, Kevin saying people call in sick to work because they just can't be bothered going. They don't feel a connection to go. Some skip breaks. They speak inappropriately or abruptly to colleagues. They gossip about colleagues. They bury their head in the work. Or perhaps there are some people who avoid tasks and avoid them perhaps at any cost. Moving then, or they stab others in the back. Thanks, Kevin. Absolutely. Moving then to the top right quadrant of the matrix, we then look at, well, what can team members do to move members of the team towards that shared purpose? Yeah, sorry, Michael's just saying as well, an away move might be talking about colleagues on Twitter, on Facebook, on some of those social media channels. That could even be emailing colleagues at work about a colleague while they're sitting in front of you. So those are all behaviours that would move us away from our shared purpose. If we look at those towards moves, well, what could team members do in terms of behaviours, what I would see and what I would hear people doing that move them towards the group's shared purpose? Well, they could be things like they could perhaps encourage colleagues. They could create forums for reflection to be able to provide support. They could really listen to colleagues rather than pretending to listen. And they, from a leader's perspective, ensure perhaps that tasks are allocated fairly, that we share positive stories about our colleagues, because it's not just down to the leader to share those stories, it's anybody in the organisation. Perhaps even we have walk-in meetings. So we think about, well, if we're working on that shared purpose, then what impact will that have on resilience and fulfilment? And what we do know is, well, if we're making those towards moves, there's a difference between moving towards and away. Because if we spend our time on some away moves in behaviour, it's likely that we will be in that vicious cycle of circling on the left side of the matrix between those behaviours and what goes on in our mind. So if I eat, perhaps on an individual level, I eat some takeaway, it leads me back to beating myself up the next day about, well, why did I do that? So moving towards that group shared purpose, or moving towards who and what is important to us as individuals, helps us then to feel better about ourselves and what we're doing in life. And using the matrix then is helping us to put that down on paper, and is to notice the difference, to live life on purpose. So when we're working with teams in organisations, what we do is we train leaders to use the matrix with their teams to understand the I and understand the we, so that team members or team leaders perhaps can use the matrix on a weekly or a monthly basis, perhaps at team meetings, to help continue to move people towards that shared purpose. Michael says, I can't imagine who would talk about colleagues on Twitter. Absolutely, Michael, we wouldn't do that, would we? But there are some that might. So again, you can see that if we give the example of what could happen, we're not trying to expose individuals, and we're not trying to name and shame. We're simply trying to get colleagues to understand what is important in terms of moving towards that shared purpose. It's about keeping the focus on in terms of that shared purpose, rather than perhaps a strategy being something that people talk about now and again. If we use the ProSocial Matrix on a regular basis, we can help people to identify what they're doing. We can then also create that shared language with the team about knowing what is going on with the away moves and the towards moves, and that we can help each other understand the difference between what is going on in our mind and those behaviours. So for example, in the mind, I often say, well, my mind is telling me, or I'm noticing that my mind is telling me, I'm having the thought that. So we teach people to learn to step out of what's going on in the mind and step out of that vicious circle, which is where we find teams perhaps in conflict and broken when they're operating on the left side of the matrix. So having briefly explained the ACT matrix and the ProSocial matrix, We know that if people are moving towards their shared purpose, they are likely to feel that they are living a more rich, meaningful, and fulfilled life. I'm sure already some of you have some questions out there about how this can be used. Could you perhaps use the chat box so that I could help with some of these? So yeah, sorry, I see as well, Gail said some of the towards moves there might be about building alliances from their point of view by gossip and email. Sorry, that's an away move. Do we have any questions that you'd like to know in terms of how the ProSocial matrix could be used in the workplace in terms of resilience and fulfillment? Okay, so Kevin's asking about conflict resolution. And again, using the matrix, the ProSocial, in terms of conflict resolution helps individuals again to understand, if we just even come back through those questions about, if we focus on that shared purpose and if collaboration is important, if we need to think about conflict resolution, it's thinking about what is then going on in the mind in those team colleagues. So for example, conflict may occur because there are individuals that think, well, nobody cares. That generalization, when in fact that's quite clearly probably not the case in conflict, because conflict will occur perhaps when both are quite passionate about their own position. So it's using the matrix to look at, well, is this an away or a towards move in terms of, if there is conflict and I ignore colleagues, is that an away or a towards move? And clearly ignoring colleagues would be an away move in terms of conflict. And so we would then work on the top right side of the matrix by looking at what could we do that would move towards the group shared purpose when there is conflict. Anybody got any suggestions about what a towards move might be when we're in conflict? While I'm waiting for that, I see Michael has asked a couple of questions here. So if we're working with an organisation, how do you assemble the audience for a training session? Which is a good question. And to begin with, some of what I've done is I've started with the leaders in the organisation and training them to be able to use the ProSocial matrix by teaching them how to use, first of all, the ACT matrix and the ProSocial matrix. So sharing that with the leaders, getting them to work with those matrices, and then asking them to use those with their teams. I'd maybe agree a follow-up meeting, maybe a month or two later, to see how they're getting on and help coach them further with that. It might be, even if we're not training leaders, that it might be bringing together teams to look at what's going on in the team. So yeah, if we're looking for delegates, it's helpful, I think, that we bring people together from one team, because if we get one team working better together, then they will start to understand, using the ProSocial matrix, how that might impact on the wider team and the collaboration that might be required. The other question Michael has is there an upper limit in terms of people in the room? And the answer to that is not really. As many people as we can get into the room, having these conversations, getting those conversations started so that people can start to notice some of what they are doing. And I recall even doing this with a team some months ago, team members really shocked by not realizing that some of the behaviors that they were doing had an impact on others. And simply noticing and listening to others really helped that team to move forward together. To improve, in this case, we were using the ProSocial Matrix to improve the customer experience, because how team members feel when they come to work will ultimately have an impact on the customer experience. So coming back to any questions that you have, I'd be grateful if you could pop those in the chat box. Or for those of you that have heard about ACT or the ProSocial Matrix, I think Kevin and myself would also appreciate your thoughts on how you feel about using the ProSocial Matrix.
I turned on my microphone. Gail put in there, how do you handle naysayers?
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Kevin. Okay, thank you, Gail. So the naysayers I'm taking from that, you're talking about people that might say, nay, I either don't want to do this, or nay, this won't work. Am I right, Gail? Great. Okay, so those naysayers, using the matrix, certainly even at an eye level, will start to hear what it is that is in their mind. It's those difficult people that, again, might cause some conflict in the room. It's about them understanding what is going on in their mind. It's about helping them to understand what their away moves might be. When people understand what their away moves might be, and they understand what is important to them, then they will be able to think more about what towards moves might be. Now, again, what we can't expect, Gail, is to wave that magic wand and to believe that after the use of the matrix once, that people will change. People will start to notice. The way of creating change for individuals is to notice what they are doing. And so there will be perhaps some small changes first of all, and then using the matrix on a regular basis, certainly even those difficult people, leaders using the ACT matrix with those individuals, even to help them improve their performance and their relationships with colleagues, can be really useful. But then using it as the ProSocial Matrix helps the team to think about what is it that we need to do as team colleagues. It helps to define some of those behaviours that go with those shared values and shared purpose of the organisation. Thank you, Gail, for that. Thanks, very much appreciated. Thank you. So yeah, using the matrix for individuals through coaching can be exceptionally useful, and using the ProSocial Matrix then as teams. So even from a resilience and fulfillment point of view in the workplace, leaders can use the ACT matrix to coach individuals to help improve that, and then use that with the team in terms of helping the team with those behaviours that are required to move towards that shared purpose. And if we think about them, well, you know, what might the benefits from all of that be? Well, if people are more resilient and fulfilled when coming to work, they'll be at work, they'll be attending, they will be productive, they will be engaging, they will be collaborating with team colleagues, they will be supporting colleagues through whatever it is they might have to go through. So again, maybe any other questions out there that anybody has? Thoughts in terms of how useful, simple this might be in terms of using this with your teams in the workplace? Okay, well, while I'm waiting for those in case no more questions pop up, what I'd like to do is to thank you for your time. Thank you for attending today. I hope you've got some useful takeaways to get started in terms of improving resilience and fulfillment in your workplace. If you'd like to know more, I've given you my web address and email address, which is julieallenconsulting.com. Or if you'd like to know more about the ACT Matrix Academy, which Kevin runs, you can find details of that on the actmatrixacademy.com. Cole, thank you very much, and thank you for attending. As I say, I hope it was useful. For those of you on the other side of the Atlantic, have a great afternoon, and those of you on this side, have a great evening. Thank you for attending. Thanks, Gail.
Thank you, everybody. Here we go.